my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Karima Clayton and Daren Bascome. Dr. Karima Clayton is a psychologist and consultant at WorkHaven, where she directs the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program. And Daren Bascome is the founder and creative director at Proverb, which is an award-winning global brand building agency. One thing I did want to quickly note is that we will be having a Q&A session after the conversation. So if you have any questions, feel free to use our Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of Zoom. And we'll get to that at around 12:45. So with that, Karima and Daren, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Tori, for the introduction. And it's great to be here with you all today. I know that time's gonna fly, so we definitely wanna jump in. I'll give a little bit more of an introduction for myself, and then Daren will do the same. As Tori mentioned, I am a licensed clinical psychologist, and I also am a consultant for a firm called WorkHaven, where we have a variety of focuses that our firm works on. But I think in the last year or two, we've really taken a focus on organizational wellness and resilience, as well as DEI-related content. And I think, as we speak about this today, or as we speak about different issues today, it'll kind of come to the forefront or really be highlighted why this has been the focus in a lot of organizations in the last couple of years. So I'm happy to kind of speak about mental health generally, and of course, thinking about it in the context of organizations today. And Daren, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Great stuff. Thanks, Karima. My name is Daren Bascome. I'm both a designer and an entrepreneur, and at Proverb. We're an agency that focuses primarily on placemaking and place branding, and really sort of looking at how we can create places that people really do love and inhabit with a sense of shared purpose. That work really revolves around sort of many different kinds of locations. It could be anything from affordable housing to luxury condos, from high performance lab to a new neighborhood. Increasingly, we're also working directly with municipalities, oftentimes to drive a new narrative to support economic development. We're working with destinations, with cultural institutions, and other places that people seek out to gather. I would say that much of the work that we do here really kind of lives at a cross section between sort of research and strategy, storytelling and design, placemaking and place branding, and equity and a sense of belonging. And certainly, we look over the last 18 months, just given everything that we've collectively been going through, those themes have been showing up front and center as we think about, how do we build back, and what do we want to try to create more of in the world.
Great, thanks, Darren. So I guess, we'll jump in. What we're going to do today is I'm first going to talk a little bit generally about mental health. And then, of course, we're going to talk about it in the context of design and creatives, right? And I think that it's important to think about it in the context of the industry that you all are in, as well as thinking about it on a more general level, because mental health is something that really impacts everyone. So I definitely want to give kind of an overview of that. And then Darren will speak to it in the context of his organization. And then, of course, as Tori mentioned, we are planning to have a Q&A session at the end. So we'll be very mindful of time to ensure that we get to that. So I guess in the context that I want to present mental health in is really thinking about it in the workplace, right? I think that this is something that has historically been a little bit more taboo, right? I'd say that in the last couple of years, it has been a more welcomed dialogue in the workplace, whereas historically, it's kind of been very hush-hush, like, oh, you shouldn't talk about that. Is it safe to kind of ask people about that? And so I think there's been a lot of concern about this topic in the workplace. And as many of you know, what's happened in the last couple of years is we have been inundated with crises that have really brought it to the forefront in the context of the workplace, where leadership and executive teams are starting to recognize that mental health is linked to productivity in ways. that they're seeing that if they focus more on mental health and be more mindful of how their employees and staff are doing in that way, that it actually, in the long run, it helps the organization as a whole as well. So we're helping the individual, and they're also seeing how it can really improve the climate and environment of the workplace. So, you know, when we think about what's happened in 2020 and 2021, of course, there's COVID. There is so the racial traumas and things that we have seen in that context. There's been political extremism, there's been wildfires, there's been hurricanes, there's been earthquakes, right? And I could go on and on and on and on about all of the things that have happened that have really had an impact on individuals and our mental health. And I think that oftentimes people underplay the impact some of these things have had on their mental health. So just to give a statistic, I'm very weary of statistics because I recognize that only certain people are surveyed, right? That you can't access everyone. But one of the surveys that I'll highlight, in 2019, they reported that about 1 in 10 people were reporting anxiety and depressive related symptoms. In the last year, there was another survey done, and they're saying 4 in 10 adults are reporting these symptoms of anxiety and depression. I still think that number is not quite capturing, you know, when we think about some of our underrepresented populations who don't have access to certain resources that are not getting surveyed. So I think this number is a little higher, but it still goes to show that there's at least been that much of an increase in those who've been surveyed. And so a lot of people have talked about the stress and isolation and other environmental factors that have really been amplified this last year and contributed to more emotional and mental health related distress or duress. Again, I want to highlight that, but I'm weary because I do think the numbers are higher than that. And then some other things I want to highlight just more generally when we're thinking about mental health is that we all have mental health. Right? I think that it's something that people tend to think about with a lot of stigma related, right? That they tend to think about mental health and they go to the extremes, right? They think about psychotic related disorders, or they think about deep depression, or they think about the worst kind of anxiety. And so I think that oftentimes people go to the extremes rather than seeing mental health as a spectrum, right? That you can be in good mental health in the same way you can be in good physical health, or you can have more difficulties. So I think that it's something that impacts everybody, that we really need to think about in that way, that it's not just some people, but that mental health impacts all of us. And with that in mind, right, then it's going to impact all employees in a workplace, despite a leadership position or someone who's on line staff. It doesn't really matter. Everyone has a mental health related. It doesn't necessarily have to be a difficulty, but their mental health is significant in the context of the workplace. Other things to think about: mental health doesn't just affect the mind. I think that some people think that that you can kind of just consciously decide, I'm going to leave this issue at home and go to work and go about my day. And that's the ideal, but I believe, and maybe not every psychologist does, but a lot of us believe that there's a mind-body connection, right? That what we are experiencing emotionally and mentally has a physical effect, right? That we carry that stress, the tension in our body, it builds up, and ultimately affects your engagement in different spaces, whether it's interpersonal relationships or even how you're functioning at work, right? A lot of people may report that they notice a difference in their ability for output or their engagement in work when they're not feeling their best, or when they're feeling overburdened by other things, right? So I think it's important to recognize that we are whole humans, and that we can't just put things really in a box, that it actually continues to have an impact even when we try to put it to the side. And then one more thing I wanted to highlight just more generally about mental health is that we can, and again, I'm weary to just focus on the outcomes part of this, or productivity, but when it comes to businesses and organizations, a lot of times that's the appeal in focusing on mental health or wellness or work-life balance or different issues like that in the workplace, that there's a benefit to the organization, that there is, we do see that businesses thrive when they have happier employees, right? And that can be connected to a lot of things. That can be because you are being mindful about mental health. It can be related to DEI content, which also has a connection to mental health we're seeing. It could be creating spaces for wellness or promoting work-life balance. I think a lot of the generations of employees coming up now have really put a priority on work-life balance, where I think historically it was just like work, work, work till you retire, and then you can relax. Whereas a lot of people now are like, no, I actually care about my well-being and want to be able to enjoy my life and enjoy my job in ways. So I think that people now are recognizing that employees are looking for something different in the workplace. So it's becoming more appealing when workplaces are really promoting these types of environments. And then again, I know I'm going to speed through, but feel free to ask me questions, and my information will be available to you beyond this talk. But I do want to highlight a few things about mental health when we think about in the context of creative and industry. Sorry, and feel free. I know that it's not ideal always doing things virtually, but if you have comments or thoughts about mental health specifically in the creative industry and things that we can be thinking about or things that are different, please feel free to share your comments. I would love to kind of see your thoughts on that. I'm going to highlight a few of what I've seen in research and in speaking with creative or people in the creative industry. So people have talked about some of just the general struggles that people in this industry have experienced that have been heightened in the last couple of years, right? So people have talked about the battle with anxiety, depression, imposter syndrome, the effects of constantly being evaluated in terms of your work and what you're producing, burnout related to the amount of work or the time that you have for projects. And people talk about how some of this has been exacerbated in the context of the pandemic and all of these other environmental things going on, that there has continued to be a pressure to produce despite some of these things happening in the larger environment. So thinking about that, right? So there's already mental health related difficulties that people are endorsing, and then it can be intensified based on what we've been seeing in the last year. Other things people have talked about is the impact of telework, especially as creatives, and how people kind of access their work or how they tap into their creative side, and how some of that has been limited with COVID, not having access to certain spaces or to the resources people typically engage. Now, I recognize that's twofold, because I've also spoke to creatives who describe themselves as more people who are more to themselves, right? Or not maybe social butterflies, that in some ways having their own space has been really helpful. So again, I recognize that's twofold, but there's still been the adjustment to telework that I think has been difficult. Another thing that was mentioned or that I did some reading about is that the relationship with creatives and their work has shifted and changed, including a sense of self, that these are things I think that people have started to look internally in a different way, that the pandemic has really kind of really, and maybe this is part of the telework part, that you spend more time with self, with your thoughts. And so people talk about just how it's changed their relationship with their work as well. People talk about how that has kind of contributed to different ideas or tapping into different things that they hadn't previously based on what they've been seeing and observing in their climates and their communities. Okay, so that's a snapshot. There's also, talk about the high pressure work environment and self-doubt that can really emerge in the context some of these spaces. But again, I just wanted to highlight some of the things that, one, are important about mental health, but also thinking about mental health specifically in the context of your industry. And again, I don't think I've exhausted the conversation as much as really tried to give a snapshot to set the tone for some of what we're going to talk about today. Some of the things that Darren and I may touch on today include talking a little about staff burnout, workload, work-life balance, which I've mentioned a little bit about, DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion related content, office culture, mental health benefits, things like that that might be available to you in your workplace. Again, I don't think we'll be able to exhaust all of these, but I do hope that we can kind of give a nice overview or provide resources that can be helpful to you all. So with that said, I want to kind of open it up to Darren to speak to some of his experiences in the context of the industry. And I know, Darren, I just kind of gave a snapshot around mental health, but I guess I want to kind of check in on some of your initial thoughts, reactions, or things you kind of want to jump in and share with us now.
Sure, I had to resist offering up an amen as you kind of made your way through your list. Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like I kind of live this on many different levels. Next year will be our 25th year in business, and the first 8 years of that was me as a freelancer, essentially a solopreneur. And what I can certainly tell you is that I think the nature of creative work is that oftentimes your identity is so closely tied to the things that you do, and and that can be amazing, particularly when things are going well, and can create, I think, sort of real, areas of concern when things aren't going so well, and that oftentimes, to your point, you're alone in your thoughts. As we, approached, what then became, sort of this massive, transition into remote work. I remember speaking with our HR consultant, and we were kind of tracking COVID, and we had started having these conversations perhaps even a month, before things really started to shut down. And I remember her at one point saying, Darren, we're starting to advise people that that they're going to need to go remote at least for a week, and and here are some of the things that we're going to need to start to consider. It's one thing to think about, one or two people, operating remotely. It's a whole other thing to try to create the whole organization. And how do you start to, conceive, clear protocols, and, how do you make sure that we're able to do the work safely? And then like a week later, she said, I know I told you a week, we're now thinking that it's 2. And I was like, oh my God, like, how are we ever going to do this? And sort of resisting, everything in terms of, not just wanting to, to freak out around this. And, I remember on that first Monday and at Proverb, we have an all team meeting first thing. And we essentially analyze, every project that's in house, and we kind of talk about, any barriers in terms of being able to move things forward, and obviously, we're in this great unknown, where none of us knew, what to expect, and, how do you actually, start to, talk about things in a way that is both meaningful and helpful, just given, that's what we need to do, both as as people, as a community, and as a company. I remember sort of leaning into something that I had heard Clarence Otis say, who used to be the CEO of the Darren Group, back in 2010, and it was really around this idea that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and that it can really force you to make hard decisions, or it can really help you to innovate, and and if you were able to do that inside of an uncertain time, that oftentimes you can really accelerate as you exit, and so for us, at that time, we weren't entirely sure what that actually meant in terms of what we would try to innovate around, or what hard decisions we would make. But one of the things that became almost immediately apparent was that as a service-based company, we aren't successful if our people aren't successful. That is the lion's share of 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 our assets, to kind of use a I know, a kind of a strange sort of business term, and so we found ourselves really trying to sort of focus in on over communicating, both in terms of the team, sort of building in several times of day, for people to just kind of check in and have unstructured conversations, kind of trying to replace, the more informal things that would happen, if we were all in the same place at the same time. It's really easy to end up with, a calendar that's entirely filled and that you're just going from one Zoom to the next. And, and that isn't always healthy as well. It can create its own type of isolation. We also, try to have sort of group conversations, around how people were doing, or, what were some of the things that were working, or, and it showed up in, some of the more obvious ways, but also in some ways that were less expected, even things like trying to build in opportunities for movement, and other types of breaks. We've become big proponents of walking meetings, and things along those lines, as, a way of being able to introduce an additional sense of perspective, or, or even, helping people to experience some endorphins, in a time that's been really, really stressful. I would also say that, having sort of one-on-one, conversations as well, just given that, not everyone is an extrovert, or not everyone is comfortable sort of talking about these themes publicly. And so, wanting to, understand, how we can be helpful, and really try to set people up for some success. And then lastly, even trying to do some things that are fun. We gave everyone a stipend, to be able to use around something that would bring them some joy. And and so it was really interesting, to hear about some of the purchases that people then made. And it was everything from a Peloton subscription to someone who bought a kayak that they had been eyeballing for a long time on Craigslist, to other types of things. And so I would say that the more that you can do to really sort of be mindful on these things, I think oftentimes it can lead to better outcomes. I also think that the more that you think about these things and really sort of institutionalize them, they can also help you to be more competitive as a company. When we look at the landscape that we're in right now, and you see sort of so much attrition and so many organizations, and anyone who runs an organization recognizes sort of the costs associated with acquiring or onboarding a new employee. But the statistic that is less talked about is the costs associated with losing someone, and oftentimes that's 2 to 3 times sort of what that new acquisition costs. And so, these themes, in terms of, wanting to create, a sense, a culture that really supports people in, both being well and being excited and being engaged, is really key in terms of, long-term success.
Great, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Darren. I actually, I love so much of what you said. I think that's something that really stands out to me. I think a lot of organizations experienced this when the pandemic started, where it's like, oh, we'll be out for a week or two, and then we'll come back and everything will be fine. And it really turned into far more than I think everyone anticipated. But it sounds like you were really flexible. Your organization started trying to figure out what to do with this, and where do we go from here? And I think that's actually really important to the mental health of our staff, our employees, is that we can't just assume we're going to be able to go back to the way things were. I think in some ways it's going to require us to be flexible and creative in thinking about how we can do things differently moving forward. And also addressing some of these new issues that I think have really been brought to the forefront in the context of the pandemic and all the things that have been happening this year. So I love hearing about what you all have been doing. The walking groups, I think, is excellent. Stipends, things like that, you really get staff buy-in, and it makes staff feel like that they matter in a way that I think can really help their mental health and also contribute to their engagement in a different way in their workspace. So I think this is great what you all have been doing. Yeah, I guess I have a question for Darren. I guess in terms of like addressing mental health or addressing staff burnout or work-life balance or any of these things, DEI content, I guess, how do you feel like it's been received by your staff, or how engaged have people been in some of those dialogues?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that we really tried to do, inside the last 2 years has been to really lean into our values, and to try to make those something that is more and more public, and so to sort of see everything from the events sort of in response, sort of in and around George Floyd and what have you, and to be able to have conversations, as an organization, about, what is it that we're seeing, and sort of what do we want to try to do, as part of our response inside of these types of things. I think that, historically, when you look at companies, the prevailing wisdom has been to try to be neutral, and you don't talk about this at work, or we don't take, these types of positions or things along those lines. And, and I think that that's certainly one way to run an organization, but I think that, if you look at, some of the themes that we oftentimes hear, in terms of people wanting for relationships that are more authentic, well, you can't have authentic relationships if you aren't willing to be vulnerable. If you look at sort of the response around, Simone Biles, for instance, this summer, it was, an amazing moment in terms of being able to talk about sort of what it actually takes, to be able to show up and perform at this exceptionally high level, and and so I think that those types of things can make you more human. I think that, when your values are more explicit, and, even if you take a company like Nike, and its response, to, Colin Kaepernick and sort of other athletes in terms of the positions that they've been taking, the prevailing wisdom or the immediate response was that this was going to be bad for business. And, you had people who were threatening to burn sneakers and things along those lines, and some actually did. But when you look at sort of, what was there on the other side of that, in the ways in which, if you're really able to lean into your values, if particularly if they support, work-life balance and, people being able to be their fuller selves, while at work, some really exciting things can be unlocked. I would also say that, one of the things that, that COVID has revealed is that, people's lives are really messy. And and work doesn't just happen in a box. And so, whether that's, people who need to deal with, childcare, or taking care of, other members of their family, or pets, or anything else that may be going along with that, and so you can't really expect people to bring their full selves if you aren't also willing to bring a level of flexibility, a level of support, and even as we're thinking about sort of the reentry into the workplace, just given how isolated many of us have been, and how do you actually do that in a way that is going to increase your likelihood of success, in terms of doing that in a way that really is harmonious. For us, we did a whole suite of workshops, at Proverb, around, not just around, sort of DE&I and belonging, but also around, communication, around sort of bullying and sort of anti-bias and things along those lines, and I think that, oftentimes with isolation, you can have a narrative that gets reinforced, that doesn't necessarily sort of lead to, that doesn't necessarily lead to, a clear path forward in terms of, how do we actually sort of come back together as a group and do that in a way that is, respectful, productive, and sustainable.
Great. Thanks, Darren.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight a couple of things that I think Darren mentioned that are important for us all to think about, of course, in the context of mental health, is really even thinking about this transition back into the office that may be happening for people. Some people have been out of the office well over a year at this point, and there is like a reintegration that needs to happen. So I love something Darren mentioned that they've been doing in terms of workshops or even retreats or creating spaces that really engage dialogue intentionally about different things, whether it's DEI related content or mental health, but really intentionally creating these spaces, even team building, right? I know a lot of organizations have done hiring during the pandemic, and there's been some staff that have left organizations. So in some spaces, there's new staff members who have had no contact with the rest of the team. And so in some ways, there has to be intentional spaces created to facilitate team building or dialogue on some of these issues that can be more difficult. And so again, for me, I'm looking at the bottom line as mental health, right? What kind of dynamic and space am I creating by inviting these conversations in, right? If I can create a space where my staff feel comfortable sharing how they're really doing or being vulnerable about certain topics, or feeling even safe to talk about things that I think that people feel like historically they haven't been able to talk about in the workplace, that ultimately can contribute to overall improvement in mental health when you feel that way in a workspace. So again, I think it's great hearing some of the initiatives that you all are doing to address that, Darren.
Yeah. And Karima, I was just going to ask, obviously you have an exposure to these themes, and this work across many different types of organizations, and and for those who may be listening, it may be, everyone from a solopreneur to people who are running large organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe at a macro level talk a little bit about how to start conversations like this, and how do you actually go about it in a way that is useful?
Yeah, great question. So I think it kind of goes along with some of what you have done, and what I was just kind of highlighting is that I think these spaces have to be created intentionally, right? I think that I do think that speaking to it more informally can be helpful for some, but I think that if we want to think about the impact on the workplace climate and the environment, then intentional space has to be created where it actually seems like something that the workplace or our employers think is important. So whether it's workshops or retreats or educational spaces to kind of learn about some of these things. I know in a lot of EAPs or employee assistant programs will provide even talks about mental health and bring awareness. So I think that it's important to think about how to create intentional spaces, especially when you think about what's been happening the last couple of years. Our climate is really ripe for these discussions, right? I mean, everybody's thinking about something that's happening in our environment. So it's not crazy if you brought up any of these topics, right? I joked with some of my some people I've worked with who felt less comfortable talking about the diversity related content. I was like, well, everybody's asking everybody about COVID. I mean, it's not weird at all. Everyone's asking how people are managing, navigating, is everyone in their family okay? But when it comes to George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or some of the other incidences that have occurred around race or diversity content, people felt less comfortable. And I told people, listen, like it's in our climate in the same way, right? We can't turn on the news without watching this thing or hearing something about it. And so it shouldn't be more taboo just because it does kind of lead to maybe more sensitive conversations, particularly about race, which some people don't feel as comfortable engaging dialogue in. And so I think part of the reason for this is because we have been very intentional with keeping these topics out of the workplace. And so I think for it to be more comfortable, we have to start engaging these dialogues, right? I think that a lot of people who are a part of underrepresented groups, whether it's racially, ethnically, religion, able status, anything like that people have been impacted by issues related to diversity. And so I think it's important to start creating spaces where people can kind of feel more comfortable to talk about it, right? Microaggressions happen, biases happen in the workplace. So how to bring these things into the forefront. And I think part of that's intentional spaces. For some people, I think it's necessary. I know a lot of orgs and people have tried to facilitate these dialogues on their own, right? Where supervisors may lead the conversations or leadership might take over. I think in some ways that doesn't always create the safest space, right? Where people feel like they may be being evaluated by their leader or supervisor. So you just have to be mindful. I think if that's the only option, it's better than not bringing it up at all. But I do think if possible, it's more ideal to bring in a third party or someone who's more of an expert in facilitating some of these dialogues and spaces. And the hope is to create as safe a space as possible. And so sometimes I think it requires someone who's not formally a part of the organization. And it also may require doing the conversation in smaller groups, right? So some of you work for small firms, some larger. And so it might be important to think about even if you're creating an intentional space with 100 employees, it may not promote the type of space you're hoping in terms of the depth of the dialogue. So it might be important to think about, do we do this by team or do we offer it on different days or however, so that you're creating a space that feels more safe and comfortable to have some of these more difficult dialogues. So yeah, I think those are some of my thoughts on that. All right, I want to be mindful of time.
Yeah. It looks like there are a few questions in the chat. I don't know if we want to try to respond to some of those as well.
Let's see. Well, on my end, let me see. Maybe I'm not looking at the chat first. Can you read the questions you're seeing to me, Darren? For some
Sure,
reason,
absolutely. Yeah. So this first one is from Matthew Harvey. Karima mentioned earlier that often DEI and mental health initiatives are motivated by productivity. Do you think it's also possible to prioritize mental health as an end goal in its own right? And does that look different?
Oh, great question. I think it is possible. I actually think that's the ideal, right? Because I think in some ways when employers have a bottom line related to productivity, that they only go so far with it, right? That they don't kind of continue to push the content or create spaces in a way that's going to be helpful for a longer period of time, right? So for example, in my consulting, when we talk about creating different spaces or thinking about wellness or staff burnout, I think that a lot of employers will be like, well, we did a workshop, we did a retreat, like this should be good enough. We've shown that this is important. But for the organizations that want to really make it a priority, then oftentimes there's more longevity related to what's implemented, right? So they may create wellness spaces that are going to happen once per week, right? Where they might bring in, there's one organization that brings in like someone who does yoga, someone who does all these different types of wellness. It kind of just rotates each week. And I think in some ways that is creating a different culture. that it's not just like, hey, we've done this one stop to address it. But I think that it changes it changes what it seems like the priority is when it's so built into the structure of the organization. So I really agree with you. I think that mental health is actually in itself should be the goal. And there's of course benefits related to that rather than the goal being productivity. So I think a lot of times it kind of manifests itself in the context of what the organization actually does to address these things. You can kind of see where their priorities are falling. So good question.
Right. And so the next one in here is anonymous, and it's a solopreneur question here. I said that a day full of Zoom meetings can be isolating in its own way, and really looking for me to say a little more about that. Yeah, I would say that for me, at least, I find that needing to be on all the time without necessarily having any kind of structured downtime or even sort of building in time to be able to respond to email and all those types of things increases my level of anxiety. And so I've been trying to be very disciplined in ensuring that the whole day isn't entirely available just for Zoom meetings. I think that even some of the incidental breaks that we used to have in terms of traveling from one location to another created an opportunity for us to be able to have conversations or have a check-in or even to build in a breather. For me, just speaking personally, one of the things that I was able to do, and I've been a runner for some years, but historically that would be the first thing that I would do when I get out of bed. Inside the last 2 years, I started using one of these meditation apps, and that's actually the first thing I do. And and at this point, I tend to think of it as a public service. I think that I'm both kinder and perhaps a bit more effective, on the days that I do it than the days that I don't, so I try to do it as often as I can. But even things like, having a routine and trying to get a sense of, what things work for you, whether it's, staying hydrated, for me, when I don't drink enough water, I feel off, or, if I'm not eating the right types of things, I feel off. And not to sort of conflate those things with mental illness or things along those lines, but I think that when these things are off, they can show up in similar ways. I would also say that in terms of other things that you can do to be less isolated, I would say that finding other people who are doing similar things, and so whether that, if you're a solopreneur, perhaps trying to connect with others, who, are taking a particular or similar career tack. I knew that for me when I was working on my own, it could be everything from a computer issue, and it could completely throw off your whole day, and there really weren't that many people that I could talk to about, what was going on, or, having a client who, is paying late, like all of these types of things can really create, considerable stress, particularly, if you are dependent on that income or have others, that you're trying to provide for or what have you. So I would say that, certainly, focusing in on the things, that you have some direct control over is a good place to start, but certainly also, trying to connect with, others who are going through similar things, perhaps could be helpful as well.
Such a great answer, Darren, to that question. Because I just want to highlight this part too, right? And I know we have some solopreneurs and we have people who work with firms and organizations. And in some ways, the ideal is that, right, these spaces are being created for us or promoted for us. but in reality, oftentimes they're not. And so I think that the onus falls on us as individuals sometimes, and in terms of how can we tend to our mental health in the most effective way. And so I love that Darren talked about hydrating, going for runs. Like, I think sometimes there's things that independently we have to do to set ourselves up to have the best mental health possible. And sometimes, and I know this is hard for a lot of us, sometimes it requires setting boundaries, creating your own work-life balance, because I think sometimes the workplace doesn't always facilitate that, right? Especially for those of you who are really just hard workers and who can get a task today and it's done tomorrow and it's amazing. You know what I mean? I think that in some place, our workspaces just expect that of us rather than always thinking about the toll that constant performance can have. So I think sometimes the onus is on us to kind of set limits and boundaries and really prioritize things that we enjoy doing and really making time for those things. Because I think once you stop doing the things you enjoy, you're not functioning on the same level, right? I think that you have biologically, your body experiences an effect to you going for a run, Darren, right? But there's things beyond your control that happen that actually contribute to your feeling better. So I just wanted to highlight, I love that you shared that, Darren, because I do think sometimes it's on us to prioritize our mental health as well, especially when we're not working in spaces that are always conducive for that.
So there's a question here from Sonia, and it's, how can we connect when we're remote without getting too personal?
Say that. How can we connect when we're remote without getting too personal? Yeah. Sorry, I'm not seeing the chat, Sonia. But I think, I think it depends on who you're like wanting to connect to, right? I think that some people, may have a few coworkers they specifically want to connect or build closer connections with. For some people, they just feel separate from the team, and I get it. The virtual life kind of promotes that. So I think in some ways, again, the onus can be on us to kind of reach out or create spaces or opportunities to connect, especially when they're not things being facilitated by our organizations, right? So some organizations I've worked with have even become really creative on Zoom, right? That a Zoom meeting doesn't just have to be we log in and talk about the agenda and we're done. But people have been intentional about how to do team building on Zoom. They've been intentional about, on Zoom, you could do breakout rooms and people do activities in small groups. People have done a post-work happy hour on Zoom, right? And again, trying to be creative virtually because we're not able to connect in the same way as we typically would, like at the water cooler or walking to the elevator or different things like that. So I think in some ways, and I'm not sure what role you're in your space, Sonia, but as a staff, it's sometimes on us to kind of offer these suggestions. But as a leader, it's on us to kind of think about how we can create some of those dynamics and spaces virtually that we're not able to live. I guess, do you have other thoughts on that, Darren? I know you've actually been kind of navigating some of that.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, a lot of this is awkward for everybody, and so, it's probably not just you in terms of, you're trying to figure out, how to navigate some of this. I think that, oftentimes, asking for permission, is a great way of being able to, open a gate, if you're unsure, if this is an appropriate thing to talk about or what have you, and that could be both in terms of, sort of raising a topic, but it could also be in giving feedback, asking someone if it's okay if I give you some feedback on this or that, if it's, a situation where you're not entirely sure, how it's going to be received or what have you. And so I think that, bringing a little strategy to this, oftentimes can be, quite helpful. So, there's another question here from Wendy, and it was, she wanted to ask about how to get more participation in her open door sessions. and if there's anything that you could share on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess when I'm facilitating those types of open door sessions or drop-in sessions or things like that for people to come into, I'm very I recognize that people may not come in offering, right? And so I think I'm very intentional about creating interactive spaces, right? So whether that is we're going to do stuff in small groups or posing particular questions that people have to answer. I think sometimes, even though it's an open door or maybe drop-in format, that having some structure in that way can be helpful, where you have a specific list of questions in the case that you need them, right? I recognize that in some spaces, once you kind of open it, people just dive in. But I don't think that's always the case, particularly if this is a new space in the space. A new space in the space, right? Where you're having conversations that typically haven't been had. So I think sometimes creating some more structure or specific questions, or I love small group work. I think that if you kind of give people a task to engage content in a different way, that it can be really helpful. And I'm not sure if that makes sense. For example, like for DEI related conversations, I oftentimes will start with, there's an activity called a privilege list. And essentially people are like grocery shopping for privileges. And it sounds crazy, and it promotes discussion, right? That people have to kind of pick and choose things together. And then we kind of talk about privilege and power and things of that sort. But I think sometimes people need something that kind of forces some engagement or interaction to then really open up the space for the dialogue. So, and I know I just kind of gave a blurb about that, but I'm happy to answer more questions later. But I think as much engagement and interaction as possible is the best. It's key.
Thanks so much, Karima. I'm going to take over on questions here to make sure we have a few minutes left. I'll make sure we get through them all. One of the anonymouses said thank you. That was very helpful. Not sure to which question that was, but thank yous all the same. So another person here asked, how can we keep our work-life balanced and our good mental health if our employers are not flexible during this difficult time?
Good question. Do you want to tackle it, Darren, or I can jump in too?
Yeah, I can speak to the things that we do. And so, and so, for us, we're trying to bring as much flexibility to the organization as we can, and so that's been everything from, as we've started to, reopen our office and then even start to sort of shut it down a bit. Everything has been, kind of by invitation. Nothing at this point has been mandated. We're assuming that, hybrid, at least for Proverb, is here to stay. And even being, flexible in terms of sort of, what time the workday starts, particularly if there are people who are traveling back in, just given that, even things like, childcare are still, largely uncertain. I would say that, wanted to bring a significant level of flexibility to sort of, where work happens, or, if there are special needs or things along those lines, and I would say that, one of the things that, the pandemic or pandemics, have revealed, at least for certain types of companies, is that, a lot of the sort of baseline assumptions, that, work needed to happen within, this container and needed to happen between sort of these hours, in order for people to be productive or for there to be, predictability in terms of, that things are actually getting done. I think a lot of that has been proven to be not necessarily the case, and if you're in a situation where you just can't trust your employees, then you probably have other issues that you really need to try to address within the organization in terms of, sort of, building stronger systems. So I guess I would say that, at least for us, we've been trying to bring a great deal of flexibility where we can, just given, how fluid everything still remains. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Karima.
Yeah, I can add, and I know, Tori, we're close to time. So my response is going to actually, I finally figured out how to get the questions, is going to also touch on the next question, which is how do we talk to our employers if we're feeling consistently burned out? It's not like we can just say we're sick all the time. So I actually think these questions go hand in hand. And I agree with you. I think this is actually one of the more difficult parts of this, that the hope is that you're working in spaces that care about work-life balance, that are flexible, and that recognize if their employees are burnt out. And oftentimes we're not, unfortunately. And so I think that, bear with me because I know it's not always easy, but I think that you have to start advocating for yourself in ways. I think that part of the problem with our employers is that they have become accustomed to us just doing and doing and doing and doing and doing and doing. And so they don't modify their behavior if they're still getting what they need out of it, right? If they're still seeing you're getting all your tasks done in a timely manner, you're still checking off all the boxes that they want, right? It doesn't seem like you're struggling at all. So I think sometimes we have to be really intentional about voicing what we're needing, whether it's about flexibility or whether it's about your burnout. Because I really think that sometimes an organization I worked with had said something like, my employees are complaining about us hiring more people, but I don't think that we need more people, right? The work's getting done. When you talk to the employees, they're like, well, we're doing all the work. And so it's like, all right, here's the disconnect. Y'all are doing all of the work, which makes it look like there's no need, but your employer doesn't recognize the need because you're doing all the work, right? And so I think in some ways we have to be mindful about how we voice our needs to our employers, because I think oftentimes there's a miscommunication or disconnect that happens. And so I think in some ways it's about really thinking about how you can advocate or voice some of your needs more directly. And it's not always easy. I think it can be trial and error, and there's different ways to do it. But I do think it becomes really important to speak up on these things, or else you'll continue to not get what you're needing from the space.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know that for me personally, it was almost like a two-phase process of one, first discovering it within yourself and then communicating that out to others and advocating to yourself. So great answer. Great questions, everyone. All right, well, we are just a minute away from time. I know that we have a couple slides that we want to show. And we have a few resources for everybody. Here they are. So we have a few mental health resources, some of which are from our side, some of which, Karima, thank you for providing some of these resources. Folks, feel free to screenshot this. And I wanted to say thank you so much to Karima and Darren. I know that a lot of what you said resonated with me. I'm sure it resonated with all of our listeners. And just want to say how grateful we are that you took the time out of your day to speak with us and speak with each other on such an important topic right now, always, but especially right now.
Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure being here.
Yeah, thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. And their ats and emails are on this screen as well for anyone who is interested. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Please look out for a post-event survey. We always want to hear from our attendees how events went, and have a wonderful day.